The House Judiciary Committee hearing room was packed that Tuesday afternoon, filled wall to wall with reporters, staffers, and citizens who sensed something big was about to happen. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to roll through. Cameras pointed toward the long wooden table in the center, where Stephen Miller, the former senior advisor to Donald Trump and architect of several controversial immigration policies, sat with a tight jaw and a cold stare. His eyes moved from face to face, calculating, as if trying to size up the battlefield before the first shot was fired. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, her back straight, her eyes steady, and her hands folded neatly on the desk in front of her. She looked calm, but anyone who had followed her work knew that beneath that calm was fire. Years of experience in courtrooms, years of fighting for those who had no voice. The tension between them was almost visible. Everyone in the room could feel it. People leaned forward in their seats, phones in hand, ready to record a confrontation they somehow knew would become history. Reporters whispered to one another that this was not just another hearing. This was going to be a showdown between one of the most aggressive defenders of Trump-era immigration policies and one of the boldest new voices in Congress. The hearing was set to begin at exactly 2 p.m. Committee Chairman Jim Jordan struck his gavel, and the low murmur in the room fell silent. You could almost hear the hum of the lights overhead. Miller adjusted his microphone, smoothed his papers, and waited for the first question. His face carried that same confidence he had shown on television for years. The look of a man used to controlling every conversation. He had faced senators, journalists, and activists, and always walked away on his terms. But this day would be different. This day, his words would meet a wall stronger than he expected. For weeks leading up to the hearing, the topic of family separation at the southern border had returned to the headlines. Documents had surfaced, showing that top officials knew how much trauma the policy would cause, but pushed forward anyway. The hearing's purpose was to uncover who knew what and when. For many Americans watching live, it was not just about policy, it was about morality. How could a country that spoke so often of freedom and family have allowed children to be torn from their parents' arms? Miller, however, came prepared to defend it all. He had pages of notes, statistics about border arrests, talking points rehearsed again and again. His strategy was simple: keep control, talk fast, dominate the exchange, and never let anyone pin him down. That tactic had worked for him in television studios and radio interviews. He didn't yet realize that Congresswoman Crockett was not just another interviewer waiting for her turn to speak. She was a trial lawyer who had spent her career cross-examining people who thought they could out-talk the truth. She had met mothers whose children had been taken from them. She had seen the tears of families who waited years to reunite. To her, this hearing wasn't a performance. It was personal. Behind Miller sat his legal team, men in dark suits whispering to one another, their faces tense. Behind Crockett sat her aides and a few immigration advocates who had lived through the policy she was about to question. Some wore shirts with pictures of children who had been separated at the border. Their eyes were fixed on her, silently urging her to speak for them. Around the room, cameras blinked red, broadcasting the scene live to millions of homes. Viewers across the country tuned in, from small towns in Texas to crowded apartments in New York, each one hoping that maybe, finally, someone in power would say what they had been feeling all along, that what happened was wrong. The early part of the hearing moved slowly. Several Democrats asked Miller about the family separation memos. He responded the same way each time. Long answers, technical language, statistics about border security, and comparisons to previous administrations. Every time someone tried to interrupt or challenge him, he raised his voice just enough to keep control. Republican members nodded along, giving him soft questions to help him recover his rhythm. For a moment, it looked like the day would unfold, just like every other hearing before it. Lots of talking, little accountability. But then Chairman Jordan looked down his list and said, "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas, Miss Crockett, for 5 minutes." The room grew still. Every camera turned toward her. She reached for her microphone, adjusted it slightly, and looked straight at Miller. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mr. Miller," she began, "thank you for appearing today. I'd like to start with something very simple. Do you acknowledge that the family separation policy caused documented psychological harm to thousands of children?" There was a pause, barely a second, but enough for everyone to feel the tension. Then Miller leaned forward and spoke quickly. "Congresswoman, what I acknowledge is that the policy was about border security." He said it sharply, as if cutting off any follow-up. Before she could continue, he added, "The real trauma came from traffickers exploiting those children, and from years of open border policies that encouraged illegal crossings." His tone was dismissive, confident, rehearsed. Crockett tried to speak again, but he kept going, his voice louder, faster, filling the air with his own narrative. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered. The chairman tapped his gavel lightly, reminding the witness to allow questions. Miller nodded, but kept his eyes locked on Crockett, daring her to interrupt him again. What Miller didn't realize was that his interruptions were revealing more than his answers ever could. Each time he cut her off, each time he raised his voice, viewers watching at home could see it. They could feel the imbalance, the disrespect. Crockett waited patiently, letting him talk himself into a corner. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, she spoke softly. "Mr. Miller, I'm referring to specific documents from your own administration. These memos show officials warning that family separation would cause lasting harm. Do you dispute your administration's own findings?" Her tone was calm, surgical. Miller smirked slightly and said, "What I dispute is the idea that enforcing the law equals cruelty. The previous administration built the cages, Congresswoman." He leaned back, clearly satisfied with his deflection. The Republicans behind him nodded. But in that moment, the viewers at home weren't thinking about cages or statistics. They were noticing something else. The way he spoke over her, the way he tried to dominate the exchange, and they were wondering how long she would let him do it. Crockett took a slow breath and glanced at the chairman. "Mr. Chairman," she said, "I'd like to remind the witness that this is my time." Jordan tapped the gavel again, barely audible. "Mr. Miller, please let the Congresswoman continue." Miller gave a tight smile, but said nothing. The silence that followed was thick. Crockett continued. "As I was saying, this memo from Health and Human Services clearly states that separation would cause, and I quote, significant and lasting psychological damage to children. These are not political opinions, Mr. Miller. These are findings from within your own administration." Miller shifted in his chair. "Congresswoman, those findings are based on biased reports." He began again, raising his voice. She spoke over him this time, but not with anger, with precision. "So you're saying that the mental health experts in your own government were biased?" The question landed like a hammer. The room fell quiet again. Miller blinked, momentarily thrown off. "I'm saying," he stammered, "that they lacked the full context." Crockett didn't press immediately. She let the silence stretch. The audience could feel the shift. For the first time all day, Miller looked uneasy. Reporters in the back scribbled notes furiously. Camera operators leaned closer to capture every micro-expression. The moment had changed. The confident strategist, who once wrote presidential speeches, was suddenly struggling to defend himself against a freshman congresswoman who refused to be rattled. Crockett's background as a civil rights attorney showed in every move she made, measured, strategic, and grounded in evidence. She flipped to another document. "Mr. Miller, This report shows that no system existed to reunite families after separation. That means children as young as 8 months were taken from their mothers, with no way to find them again. How do you justify that? Miller opened his mouth but stopped. His hands tightened on the table. "I'm not here to justify emotions," he finally said. "I'm here to talk about national security." That sentence hit the room like ice water. A woman in the gallery gasped softly. Crockett's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. She could have argued right then, could have raised her voice, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned back, as if giving him space to reveal more, as Miller went on, repeating talking points about deterrence and security. Crockett quietly underlined something on her notes. Every viewer watching at home could see that she wasn't just listening. She was building something. A case, a moment, an exposure. For years, Stephen Miller had used his mastery of language to twist arguments in his favor. But this time, every word he spoke was turning the tide against him. Every interruption made him look smaller, not stronger. People at home could see it. They tweeted about it. They messaged their friends. "She's letting him dig his own hole," one viewer wrote. The hashtag #CrocketVsMiller started to appear even before the hearing ended. By the 30-minute mark, the tension was almost unbearable. Crockett had asked only a handful of questions, but each one hit harder than the last. Miller's responses had grown faster, more defensive. He talked about previous administrations, about border chaos, about crime statistics, but never about the children. Each time he avoided her question. The audience felt the same quiet frustration she must have felt. They were waiting for her to strike back, to deliver the line that would finally stop him. She sensed it too. She could feel the energy in the room, the weight of everyone watching. But she also knew timing was everything. A lawyer's greatest weapon isn't volume, it's patience. She decided to wait. The chairman's gavel came down softly again, signaling the end of another member's questioning period. The next round would begin soon, and Crockett knew she might only have one more chance before the day's spotlight moved elsewhere. She glanced briefly at Miller. His face was flushed. His voice, once steady, now carried a hint of irritation. Every interruption, every smirk, every defensive phrase had been seen, recorded, and broadcast to millions. Crockett reached for one last document and looked up, her eyes calm, her tone level. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "before my time ends, I'd like to show you one more thing." The room stilled. Miller leaned forward, suspicious but unable to resist. Crockett lifted a page from her folder. "This is an email chain," she said, "from within your office. It includes your name. It states, and I quote, 'The deterrent effect outweighs other considerations.'" She placed the paper flat on the table. "Those other considerations, Mr. Miller," she said slowly, "were children." Miller froze. The camera zoomed in. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Crockett said nothing more. She didn't need to. The silence that filled the room spoke louder than anything else. Reporters typed. Phones lit up with breaking news alerts. On social media, clips of the exchange began to spread. People commented, "Did you see that look on his face?" Others wrote, "She nailed him." In living rooms across America, viewers who had once felt powerless now sat upright, watching a woman who refused to be silenced stand her ground with quiet strength. The hearing wasn't over, but something irreversible had happened. The man who built his career on controlling the conversation had just lost control, and Jasmine Crockett knew it. She looked down at her papers, then back up at him, her face calm and unflinching. Outside the hearing room, protesters chanted for justice. Inside, the world was watching a shift in real time. This wasn't just politics. It was accountability, raw and visible. And while no one knew it yet, what would happen in the next few minutes would ignite a national conversation that would echo far beyond those walls. But that moment, the moment when silence fell, when Miller realized he was no longer winning, was the spark that lit it all. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound in a room full of noise is the sound of someone refusing to be interrupted. And what Jasmine Crockett said next would make history. The air in the hearing room felt heavy, almost still, like time itself had paused to listen. Crockett leaned toward the microphone, her voice low, but clear enough for every word to carry. "Mr. Miller," she said, "you've interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you've shown this committee and the American people exactly who you are." The words landed like quiet thunder. People in the front row turned to each other. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Stephen Miller's expression shifted for the first time all day. He started to speak, but Crockett raised one finger. That simple gesture stopped him cold. "Men like you," she continued, "have been interrupting women like me all my life. You think volume is truth, that talking over someone makes you right. But here's what you're afraid of, Mr. Miller. You're afraid of silence. The kind of silence that forces you to face what you've done." For a moment, the only sound was the faint clicking of camera shutters. Her words echoed softly through the marble chamber. Miller blinked rapidly, his confidence wavering. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. Crockett reached into her folder and laid a series of documents on the table one by one, her movements slow and deliberate, the way a lawyer places evidence before a jury. "Let's look at what your own records show," she said. "This memo from your deputy at Health and Human Services. It warns of significant and lasting psychological harm to children separated from their parents. This internal email, which includes your name, says, the deterrent effect outweighs other considerations. Those other considerations, Mr. Miller, were human beings, babies, toddlers, families." Each sentence grew stronger. The audience could feel the emotional gravity building, as if every word added weight to the air. Miller's lawyers sat behind him, frozen. One whispered something, but he didn't react. The room felt like a courtroom, and Crockett was the prosecutor, drawing the final line between right and wrong. "You built a policy around fear," she said quietly. "You told yourself it was about safety. But safety built on suffering isn't safety. It's cruelty dressed in paperwork." Her tone was calm, not angry, but it hit harder than any shout. She paused again, eyes still fixed on him. "You may have had the power to separate families, Mr. Miller," she said slowly. "But you cannot separate yourself from the consequences of your actions." There was a heartbeat of silence, then another, and then the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, scattered applause before Chairman Jordan slammed the gavel, calling for order. But the sound didn't stop. Reporters were already texting editors. The C-SPAN cameras zoomed in on Miller's pale face. His lips moved, but no words formed. For the first time in his career, he looked like a man stripped of every defense. Crockett leaned back, folded her hands, and waited for the noise to die down. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply existed in the silence she had earned. When Jordan finally restored order, his voice sounded thin. "Mr. Miller, would you care to respond?" Miller leaned toward the mic. His voice came out hoarse, uncertain. I stand by the policy. We were protecting America." The sentence fell flat, no conviction, no energy, just words collapsing under their own weight. Crockett looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time." The gavel came down again, but no one in the room moved. Then slowly, people in the gallery began to clap. Not loud, but steady, deliberate. A rhythm that filled the space with something like respect. Even a few Republican aides looked down, unwilling to meet Miller's eyes. Within minutes, the footage hit the internet. On social media, clips of Crockett's calm takedown spread faster than any political ad ever could. She shut him down with truth, not anger. One post read. Another said, "That silence was the loudest sound I've ever heard in Congress." Hashtags bloomed across Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Crockett vs. Miller. Let her speak. ICE accountability matters. Major networks broke into regular programming to replay the exchange. CNN called it a masterclass in composure. MSNBC described it as a turning point in the national conversation on immigration and power. Even Fox News couldn't ignore it. Tucker Carlson shook his head on air and said, "Stephen Miller walked straight into that one." At Crockett's office in Texas, phones rang non-stop. Her staff could barely keep up with calls from constituents thanking her. Mothers cried over the phone. Veterans said she reminded them what courage looked like. Donations poured in for immigrant aid organizations. By sunset, the clip had crossed 10 million views. By midnight, it was everywhere. Talk shows opened with it. Morning news programs replayed it. People who hadn't watched a congressional hearing in years suddenly knew her name. Inside Republican circles, panic brewed. Aides whispered that Miller had damaged their image. "He made us all look arrogant," one congressman muttered off record. Conservative strategists scrambled to change the narrative, claiming she'd ambushed him. But every attempt backfired. The public had seen the footage themselves. No spin could erase what millions had witnessed. A man in power, silenced by his own arrogance, and a woman who refused to be belittled. Meanwhile, Crockett stayed quiet. She didn't tweet. She didn't go on television that night. Instead, she flew home to Dallas. She met with families still trying to reunite with their children. A local news crew caught her briefly outside the airport. When asked how it felt to go viral, she just said, "This isn't about me. It's about them." That humility struck people even more deeply. The story stopped being gossip and became a symbol. By the next morning, headlines covered every major paper. The Washington Post, "Crockett confronts Miller. A moment of reckoning." The New York Times, "Silence speaks louder. Representative Crockett turns. Interruption into accountability." Editorial boards praised her poise. Civil rights groups called her the voice of moral clarity. Even some conservative commentators admitted she'd handled herself with grace. In homes across America, the footage sparked hard conversations. Parents talked about empathy. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms. Retirees in small towns wrote letters to local papers about what dignity looks like in politics. One veteran wrote, "I served under 5 presidents. I've seen leaders come and go, but that young woman reminded me of the America I fought for." Miller, on the other hand, disappeared from public view for several days. His team released a short statement blaming political theatrics, but it fooled no one. He cancelled a scheduled Fox appearance, citing illness. Insiders later revealed that donors and conservative groups were furious. Behind closed doors, he reportedly told friends he'd been set up. But deep down, he knew he hadn't been trapped. He'd been revealed. Back in Washington, members of Congress replayed the hearing privately. Some studied it, frame by frame, trying to understand how Crockett had turned a 5-minute question slot into a cultural moment. It was her calm, one staffer said. She didn't fight his fire. She let him burn himself out. A media consultant described it as the most effective congressional cross-examination since Watergate. That weekend, Saturday Night Live opened with a sketch of the exchange. The audience roared as an actress playing Crockett calmly destroyed a shouting Miller impersonator. The clip got millions more views online, drawing younger audiences into the story. By Sunday, the phrase "pulling a Crockett" was trending, a new expression meaning standing your ground with quiet confidence against arrogance. In Texas, Crockett returned to her district for a community meeting. The crowd greeted her with a standing ovation. She spoke softly without grandstanding. "What happened in that room?" she said, wasn't just about politics. It was about power and respect. Too many people think shouting makes them strong. I wanted to show that strength can also sound calm. Her words drew tears from several parents in attendance. One woman, whose teenage son had been deported years earlier, whispered, "Finally someone said what we all felt." As the days passed, analysts began exploring the deeper meaning of the hearing. Psychologists discussed gender dynamics in public life. Professors dissected her rhetorical technique. News anchors compared her poise to that of civil rights icons. It became more than a news cycle. It became a cultural study in how truth and composure can overpower dominance and cruelty. Miller eventually reappeared, giving a written interview to a conservative outlet. He claimed he'd been targeted by identity politics and accused Crockett of emotional manipulation, but the response was cold. Even his supporters struggled to defend his behavior. The narrative had shifted permanently. His interruptions had become shorthand for disrespect. Her patience had become a lesson in leadership. Meanwhile, donations to humanitarian groups surged. Law schools hosted panels on congressional ethics. Young women posted videos online saying, "I had my Crockett moment today. I didn't let him talk over me." The exchange had moved from politics into everyday life. Late one evening, a video surfaced of Crockett walking alone through the Capitol hallway after the hearing. Someone had filmed her from a distance. She looked tired but peaceful, holding her folders close. The clip went viral again. The caption read, "The calm after the storm." It reminded people that courage often looks quiet. By the end of the week, the House Ethics Committee confirmed that the documents Crockett cited would be entered into the official record. That meant every statement she'd made was now part of congressional history. Unchangeable, undeniable. Commentators called it poetic justice. She hadn't just silenced Miller. She'd turned his arrogance into evidence. In interviews that followed, Crockett stayed consistent. "I'm not interested in shouting matches," she told PBS. "I'm interested in accountability." When asked what she thought of becoming a symbol, she smiled gently. "If it helps people speak up, then I'm grateful. But I didn't plan a moment. I just told the truth." Her humility kept the story alive. Late-night hosts praised her restraint. Talk radio callers argued that maybe politics still had room for integrity. Even people who disagreed with her policies admitted she carried herself with dignity. One conservative caller told a local station, "I don't like her politics, but I respect her backbone." In the months that followed, the phrase Crockett Standard began appearing in op-eds, describing a new expectation for how lawmakers should handle confrontation, with calm evidence instead of noise. Training seminars for congressional staff used the clip to teach witness control. Universities added it to communication courses. The Library of Congress archived the footage as part of a series on modern political discourse. But behind all the praise, Crockett stayed grounded. She often said the real heroes were the families who had lived through the policies she exposed. In one interview, she said softly, "I carried their stories with me that day. That's why his interruptions didn't shake me. I wasn't there alone." Her words resonated with millions who had ever felt unheard. For Stephen Miller, the fallout grew heavier. Speaking fees disappeared. Invitations dried up. Once seen as a master strategist, he became a cautionary tale. Colleagues avoided his name in public. Analysts said he'd become the man silenced by truth. And yet, the story didn't end there. The more people watched that clip, the more they wanted to know what came next. What happened after the cameras stopped? After the clapping faded? After the headlines moved on? Because deep down, Americans sensed that something had changed that day. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about what kind of nation they wanted to be, what kind of voices they were willing to listen to. Across dinner tables, people debated not policies, but values. Was strength the loudest voice in the room, or the calmest? Could compassion ever defeat cruelty in a system built on power? The conversation spread from living rooms to classrooms to churches. Crockett's moment had planted a question in the heart of the country, and that question would only grow louder in the months to come, when new hearings began, when old secrets surfaced, and when one unexpected decision would send both Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller back into the national spotlight once again, because history wasn't finished with them yet. Because history wasn't finished with them yet. The echoes of that hearing lingered far beyond the marble walls of the Capitol. What began as a tense 5-minute exchange between a congresswoman and a former White House advisor had turned into a political earthquake. Over the next few days, committees launched reviews, reporters dug through newly released documents, and public opinion shifted in ways no one had predicted. Jasmine Crockett returned to her office, expecting quiet. Instead, her phone never stopped ringing. Cable networks requested interviews. Advocacy groups wanted quotes. And fellow lawmakers crowded her doorway, offering praise or advice. Yet behind every handshake, she could sense something larger forming. Washington had smelled blood in the water. Stephen Miller, once untouchable within conservative circles, had become the story every newsroom wanted to chase. His silence at that hearing, replayed on loop, his frozen expression dissected, frame by frame. Analysts wondered aloud if this was the moment his influence died. But Washington doesn't bury power easily. It rearranges it. Within a week, Republican strategists met behind closed doors to decide how to contain the damage. They agreed on one thing: attack the messenger. Anonymous leaks accused Crockett of seeking fame. Opinion pieces painted her as overly emotional. Yet those same articles drove traffic, and with every click, her words reached new eyes. Inside the Justice Department, quiet whispers began about whether the family separation policy might have violated federal child protection laws. A mid-level attorney leaked to the press that new subpoenas were being considered. The White House distanced itself. When reporters asked the president about Miller, the press secretary simply said, "He doesn't work here anymore." Behind that line was fear. Fear that the viral hearing had reopened a wound the administration wanted forgotten. Congressional staffers began revisiting evidence long buried in digital archives. Crockett's meticulous questioning had drawn attention to documents that even veteran investigators had overlooked. Her insistence on entering them into the record made them public property, and now every newsroom in the country had access. What they found was devastating. Email threads showing policy planners discussing deterrence in cold statistical terms. Memos acknowledging that psychological impact was expected but necessary. The outrage reignited overnight. On Capitol Hill, Democratic leaders sensed momentum. They called for a new series of hearings, this time broader, digging into the decision-making process that led to family separation. Republicans braced for impact, some arguing that reopening the issue would only divide the nation further. But the footage of Miller's silence made that argument hollow. Even moderate conservatives privately admitted that the party needed distance from him. Committee chairs scheduled witness lists. Subpoenas were issued. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained steady, insisting the goal wasn't revenge, but truth. "If government policy harms children," she said in one interview, "we have a duty to understand why." That sentence appeared on headlines nationwide. Meanwhile, inside think tanks and talk radio studios, Miller's allies scrambled to rebuild his image. They framed him as a victim of political theater, claiming he'd been ambushed by a hostile committee. But the footage contradicted them. Viewers had seen him interrupt, deflect, and finally crumble. Conservative donors quietly withdrew funding from his advocacy group, America First Legal. Invitations to conferences vanished. For the first time, the man once considered the architect of Trump-era immigration policy found doors closing. Reporters camped outside his Virginia home, waiting for a comment. None came. Insiders described him pacing late into the night, furious that one hearing had undone a decade of dominance. Crockett, on the other hand, navigated newfound fame carefully. She rejected lucrative speaking offers, focusing instead on policy. When colleagues congratulated her, she redirected the conversation back to legislation. She knew Washington's praise was fickle. One misstep, and they'd call her arrogant, so she kept working, drafting what would become the Family Protection Act, a bill banning child separation, except in verified abuse cases. When she introduced it on the House floor, the chamber fell quiet. "We cannot undo what was done," she said, "but we can ensure it never happens again." The speech lasted 5 minutes, the same amount of time she'd had to question Miller. That symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered daily. Some carried signs with her viral quote, "Your legacy isn't strength, it's the sound of children crying." Others wore shirts that read, "Let her speak." Cable news covered the demonstrations live. Ordinary Americans called their representatives, demanding support for her bill. For the first time in years, immigration reform was being discussed, not in terms of walls and borders, but in terms of families and morality. Polls showed a sharp shift in public sentiment. Even voters who previously supported strict enforcement said they opposed separating children. The country was changing, and both parties knew it. In backrooms, party leaders debated how to respond. A few Republicans proposed softening rhetoric. Others doubled down, arguing that conceding now would look weak. They warned that Miller's downfall could become a blueprint for dismantling other hardliners. Yet privately, some admired Crockett's strategy. One strategist told Politico, "She didn't just defeat him, she rewrote the rules of engagement." Democrats, meanwhile, seized the narrative. Fundraising surged. Advocacy groups used the moment to push for comprehensive immigration reform. But with attention came risk. Opponents began digging into Crockett's past, searching for anything that could dull her halo. Old case files from her days as a public defender resurfaced. Conservative outlets tried to paint her as soft on crime. The attacks intensified, but each one seemed to strengthen her base. Voters respected her resilience. "If they're coming for you," one supporter tweeted, "you're doing something right." Inside newsrooms, editors debated how long the story would last. Viral moments usually fade in a week, but this one refused to die. Late-night shows joked about Miller's silence. Daytime talk shows praised Crockett's poise. Historians compared the hearing to Joseph Welch confronting Senator McCarthy in 1954. "Have you no sense of decency?" Welch had said then. Crockett's version, they argued, was modern America's equivalent. "You may have had the power to separate families, but you cannot separate yourself from consequences." The parallel stuck. College professors began adding it to civics syllabi. The clip entered classrooms. As public interest grew, so did political pressure. The Inspector General for Homeland Security announced a new audit of the family separation policy. Within weeks, leaked drafts showed damning conclusions. Officials had ignored repeated warnings of psychological damage. Miller's name appeared throughout the correspondence. The Justice Department confirmed that criminal negligence was under review. For a city addicted to power games, this was serious. Former officials hired lawyers. Cable hosts speculated whether Miller could face charges. The phrase "policy with intent" became a headline. Through all of it, Crockett stayed measured. When journalists asked whether she wanted to see Miller prosecuted, she answered carefully. "Accountability isn't vengeance," she said. "It's how we learn." That distinction earned her praise from moderates and independents. Her approval rating soared. Political action committees began whispering about a Senate run, but she ignored the noise. In private, she told aides, "The goal is justice, not promotion." Still, Washington buzzed. Every party needs a new star, and she had become one. Miller, meanwhile, made one last attempt to reclaim control. He penned an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal defending the policy as an act of national preservation. The piece was long, defensive, and filled with bureaucratic justifications. Within hours, fact-checkers dismantled it. CNN invited Crockett to respond. She declined, saying only, "The documents speak for themselves." Her silence made a bigger statement than any rebuttal could. Behind the scenes, bipartisan meetings began to address compensation for separated families. The White House signaled cautious support. When asked about Crockett's influence, a senior advisor said, "She reminded the country that compassion isn't weakness." For the first time in years, both parties discussed immigration reform without shouting. Analysts called it the Crockett effect, but Washington never stays calm for long. As new hearings loomed, leaks hinted that Miller had privately warned colleagues the committee would regret coming after him. He still had allies, powerful ones, who believed in his worldview. Conservative media outlets began releasing edited clips, portraying him as the victim of a witch hunt. The backlash grew online. Death threats poured into Crockett's office. Her staff increased security, yet she refused to be intimidated. "I won't be silent," she told them. "If I back down, the message dies." Her calm resolve inspired others. Fellow members of Congress, especially women, cited her courage as motivation to confront bullying in hearings. By midsummer, the second round of hearings opened. This time the focus was systemic. Who approved what? Who ignored which warnings? Crockett sat on the subcommittee, but chose not to grandstand. She asked brief, surgical questions, letting witnesses trap themselves in contradictions. The contrast between her precision and Miller's former aggression became a case study in leadership. Networks broadcast her exchanges live again, drawing millions of viewers. Once more, she was trending, but this time for her policy acumen, rather than confrontation. Meanwhile, internal GOP divisions widened. Younger conservatives argued for empathy-based reform, while older hardliners resisted. Editorial pages noted the generational shift. The era of cruelty politics may be ending. One columnist wrote, Miller's influence had become a ghost, haunting his own party. When asked about him during a Sunday interview, a senior senator sighed. He represented a chapter we need to close. In late autumn, the Inspector General released its final report. It confirmed what many suspected. Top officials, including Miller, had been briefed repeatedly about the emotional toll of family separation, but proceeded anyway. The report concluded that deterrence had outweighed humanitarian concerns by deliberate choice. That phrase, deliberate choice, exploded across headlines. The Justice Department announced civil penalties. Families prepared new lawsuits. Reporters rushed to get Miller's response, but he remained silent. His legal team issued a brief statement denying wrongdoing. Yet silence had already become his public identity, and that silence now sounded like guilt. Crockett read the report in her office, late one evening. Her staff had gone home. Outside, the Capitol dome glowed against the dark sky. She thought of the mothers she'd met at detention centers, of the children whose drawings still hung on her wall. She whispered to herself, "We finally proved it." Then she turned off the light. The next morning, the House passed the Family Protection Act with bipartisan support, an astonishing victory in a divided era. As she stood on the floor watching the votes tally, members on both sides approached to shake her hand. She smiled politely but stayed humble. Later, at a press conference, she said, "This isn't my win. It belongs to every family that never stopped fighting." The crowd applauded, yet she knew the story wasn't over. Reform bills can change laws, but they can't heal hearts overnight. In conservative media, reaction was swift and furious. Commentators accused her of virtue signaling. Some demanded investigations into her staff. The noise returned, louder than before. But now, the country was listening differently. For the first time, compassion had the microphone. Then came a twist no one expected. An anonymous source leaked that Miller had been subpoenaed again, this time by a federal grand jury, investigating whether officials had knowingly misled Congress. The news broke like lightning. Reporters swarmed courthouses. Legal experts debated indictments. Cable networks ran countdown clocks. Was this accountability or political revenge? The nation split once more. But one truth remained. The world would be watching him testify again. And somewhere in that same Capitol, Jasmine Crockett prepared quietly, gathering notes, reviewing evidence, ready to face the man whose arrogance had once tried to silence her. Because in Washington, stories rarely end. They return, louder, sharper, demanding new answers. And when Stephen Miller walked back into that hearing room, the world would learn whether power can ever truly escape its own past. And when Stephen Miller walked back into that hearing room, the world seemed to hold its breath. 3 years had passed since the moment that had shattered his image and launched Jasmine Crockett into history. Yet the scene felt eerily familiar. The same marble walls, the same heavy silence, the same faint hum of cameras waiting to capture whatever truth or theater would unfold next. Outside, hundreds of reporters crowded the Capitol steps. Protesters held signs demanding justice, while supporters of Miller waved flags insisting he'd been wronged. But inside the chamber, the air was tighter, sharper. Miller entered first, flanked by lawyers. His once sharp stride, now slower, deliberate, his shoulders heavier. Gone was the swagger that once defined him. In its place, a man who understood what it meant to face history twice. The photographer's bulbs flashed as he sat at the witness table again, stacking his papers in a neat, nervous line. Across from him, Representative Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone. She hadn't aged much, but the years had added something else: weight, experience. A quiet authority that filled the room even before she spoke. For weeks, rumors had swirled that this second hearing would reveal new evidence, documents that could prove deliberate deception. Cable networks had already branded it the Reckoning Hearings. Chairman Jordan called the session to order at exactly 10 a.m. The crowd hushed. "This hearing of the House Judiciary Committee will come to order," he said, gavel echoing against the desk. Cameras zoomed in on Miller's face. He looked composed, yet every twitch of his fingers betrayed tension. Behind him, his attorneys whispered reminders. "Keep calm, don't engage, answer only what's asked." But everyone in the room knew this wasn't just testimony. It was theater. And the audience outside numbered in the millions. The first hour crawled by as other members questioned him about procedural details, dates, emails, internal memos. Miller's answers were cautious, measured, rehearsed. Gone were the fiery monologues of the past. Each response was clipped, professional, almost sterile. He spoke like a man walking a tightrope over fire. Terrified one wrong word would ignite everything. But underneath the politeness, something darker brewed. Every time a Democrat mentioned the family separation files, his jaw tightened. Every time a Republican offered sympathy, his eyes flicked toward Crockett. He knew she would come last. She always did. The producers of the hearing schedule knew exactly how to build suspense. And when Chairman Jordan finally said, "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas," the room reacted like a theater audience, leaning forward for the final act. Crockett straightened her papers slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began. Her tone was calm, respectful, but there was iron underneath. "Mr. Miller, welcome back. It's been 3 years since your last appearance here. A lot has happened since then. Reports, lawsuits, and of course the Inspector General's findings." She paused, letting her words hang. "I assume you've read the report." Miller cleared his throat. "Yes, Congresswoman, I have." "Good," she said softly, Then you know it states that senior officials, including yourself, were briefed multiple times about the psychological harm caused by the separation policy and proceeded anyway. Miller shifted in his chair. That's an unfair characterization, he said quickly. The intent was never to harm anyone. It was to uphold the law. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Intent is an interesting word, Mr. Miller. You see, intent determines responsibility, and the evidence we've received suggests intent was very clear. A low murmur moved through the crowd. She continued, voice steady. Let me read from Exhibit 14. She lifted a document, the sound of paper crackling through the microphone. Email dated April 18th, 2018. Subject line, deterrence messaging. It says, and I quote, "The optics of separation will serve as a strong deterrent to future crossings. The sender is your policy advisor. The recipient is you." Miller blinked. I don't recall that specific exchange, he said. You don't recall, she repeated, her eyebrows raising slightly. Then allow me to refresh your memory. She clicked a button on the screen behind her. The email appeared projected for the room to see, his name highlighted. The audience gasped softly. It's right there, Mr. Miller. Your initials. Your approval. He opened his mouth but stopped. The moment stretched. Crockett lowered the paper. You told this committee 3 years ago that family separation was about law enforcement, not deterrence. Yet this email, your own correspondence, suggests otherwise. Her tone never wavered. Would you like to correct the record? Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. Congresswoman, internal discussions don't always represent final decisions. But they represent mindset, she countered gently. They reveal what mattered to you most. Optics, deterrence, power, not children, not trauma, not humanity. The silence in the room grew heavy again. Every camera lens zoomed in closer. Miller's hands clenched. One of his lawyers scribbled something on a notepad and slid it toward him, but he ignored it. You're twisting this, he said, his voice low. You're politicizing security. Crockett tilted her head slightly. I'm reading your words, Mr. Miller. If that's political, then maybe truth has become too inconvenient for power. The audience erupted into whispers. The chairman's gavel slammed down for order, but the energy couldn't be contained. Crockett waited until the room quieted, then spoke again, slower now, each word deliberate. Mr. Miller, do you know how many children remain separated as of today? He hesitated. I'm not sure of the exact number. It's 537, she said quietly. 537 children, whose parents have not been found. Some were deported, some are missing, and yet you say this was never about harm. Her words cut through the air like a blade through cloth. Miller's face turned pale. You're making me a villain, he muttered. No, Mr. Miller, she replied softly. I'm letting you tell your story. I just happen to have the facts beside me. The exchange replayed across news feeds in real time. Commentators typed furious updates. The hashtag, hearing of the decade, trended within minutes. But inside the room, it felt timeless. Two people representing opposite ends of America's conscience. Crockett wasn't angry. She was steady, methodical, almost judicial. Miller wasn't defiant. He was unraveling. She lifted another document. This memo, she said, comes from the Department of Justice. It quotes your statement that the emotional impact of separation is part of the deterrence strategy. Do you deny saying that? Miller rubbed his temples. Context matters, he said weakly. The media always strips context. All right, Crockett said. Provide the context, right now. What context makes the suffering of children acceptable? The room froze. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His silence filled the space until it felt suffocating. At that moment, one of the photographers snapped a picture that would later appear on front pages nationwide. Crockett seated upright, composed. and Miller slumped forward, eyes downcast, the embodiment of arrogance collapsing into accountability. When she finally spoke again, her tone softened. "Mr. Miller, you once told this committee that history would judge you kindly. Do you still believe that?" He looked up, his expression almost pleading. "I did what I thought was right for my country. And yet," she said quietly, "your country wept." The words drew an audible reaction. A woman in the gallery wiped her eyes. Even some Republican aides lowered their gazes. Crockett leaned back and folded her hands. No further questions. Chairman Jordan announced a brief recess. The room erupted into chatter as Miller's lawyers surrounded him, whispering urgently. Crockett stepped away from the table, heading toward a side door. Cameras followed her every step. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but she simply said, "We're here to uncover truth. That's all." During the break, cable networks cut between analysis panels and live footage of protesters outside. One anchor said, "It's déjà vu. Stephen Miller under fire again, and Representative Crockett once more commanding the moral stage." Another added, "The difference this time is evidence. There's paper now, not just rhetoric." Across social media, clips of her line, "Your country wept," spread like wildfire. When the committee reconvened, tension returned thicker than before. Miller's lawyers requested to read a prepared statement, but Jordan denied it. The witness will answer the committee's questions. Next up was Representative Garcia from California, who pressed Miller about missing records. Miller tried to redirect, blaming bureaucratic confusion, but his voice cracked under pressure. He looked exhausted. The aggressive debater who once thrived on chaos was now drowning in it. Then, unexpectedly, a new document surfaced. Garcia introduced an internal memo marked confidential for senior review only. It referenced a policy meeting attended by Miller, stating that optics of suffering may enhance compliance. The wording stunned the room. Reporters scrambled to tweet screenshots. Miller's lawyer objected, claiming privilege, but Jordan overruled him. The document is now part of the record. Crockett turned to look at Miller. Their eyes met for a brief, electric second. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was gravity, the kind that comes when truth finally shows its face. Miller lowered his eyes again. Hours later, as the hearing adjourned, reporters flooded the hall. The day's footage played in loops across every major network. Analysts compared Miller's collapse to political implosions of the past. One commentator said, "This wasn't just a hearing. It was a mirror. It showed America the cost of cruelty." That night, Miller released a short video through his spokesperson, claiming selective editing and partisan attacks. But it fell flat. The public had watched the raw feed. There was no editing, only reality. His approval among conservatives plummeted. Donors abandoned his foundation. Meanwhile, Crockett's bill gained 12 new co-sponsors overnight. 2 weeks later, the Department of Justice announced a formal criminal inquiry into potential perjury during Miller's previous testimony. The headlines were explosive. Former Trump advisor under investigation for lying to Congress. The footage from both hearings became central evidence. Analysts said the arc of accountability had finally caught up with him. But with the spotlight returned, so came new risks. Threats against Crockett's office increased. Her security detail doubled, yet she refused to hide. In an interview she said, "Fear is how injustice survives. We answer it with courage." Her words resonated across generations. Seniors called radio shows, saying she reminded them of leaders from another era. Firm, moral, fearless. As the legal process unfolded, the hearing became legend. Documentaries were announced. Books were written. The Crockett-Miller saga had transformed from viral clip to historical turning point. But Washington isn't satisfied with endings. It demands sequels. When rumors leaked that Miller might cooperate with investigators, In exchange for immunity, the city buzzed with speculation. What would he reveal? Who else would fall? And if he spoke, would Crockett be forced to confront him yet again? Reporters camped outside her office, waiting for comment, but she gave none. Her staff said only, "The Congresswoman believes in the process." Yet privately, she prepared. She reread every transcript, every memo, every note from families still waiting for justice. She knew if he spoke publicly again, she had to be ready, not to humiliate him, but to protect the truth. Then one chilly morning in December, an official notice arrived. Stephen Miller would testify once more before Congress, this time under oath in the criminal inquiry. The hearing would be televised live nationwide. Overnight, the Capitol filled with satellite trucks. Every network branded it the final testimony. Inside, the committee room was remodeled for overflow seating. Lines of citizens wrapped around the block. As Crockett entered, the crowd rose in silence. She nodded politely, but kept her focus forward. Moments later, Miller appeared. He looked thinner, grayer, older. But when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of unfinished business. He took his seat, adjusted the microphone, and exhaled. Chairman Jordan began. "Mr. Miller, you are reminded that you are under oath." Miller nodded. Cameras zoomed closer. Outside, America watched again. In living rooms, diners, and offices, people leaned toward screens. Some hoped for redemption, others for reckoning. Inside the chamber, time seemed to slow. Crockett opened her folder, the same one she'd used 3 years earlier. Its edges worn, its pages marked. She took a breath, and as the gavel echoed once more through the hall, she looked across the table and said the words that would begin the most consequential exchange of their lives. "Mr. Miller, let's finish what we started." And at that moment, the room erupted with flashbulbs and whispers, and the world realized this wasn't just another hearing. It was history repeating itself. But this time, the truth had nowhere left to hide. It was history repeating itself. But this time, the truth had nowhere left to hide. The hearing room was packed tighter than ever before. Cameramen leaned over rails. Reporters balanced laptops on their knees. And the air buzzed with the weight of anticipation. Stephen Miller sat once again beneath the bright white lights. The same man, but not the same presence. Gone was the arrogance that once shaped his sharp jaw and confident eyes. What remained was a man visibly aged, stripped of certainty, staring down the very history he once thought he could control. Jasmine Crockett entered quietly, carrying the same worn folder that had become symbolic of her fight for accountability. Every step she took echoed softly, yet each one seemed to fill the room with a kind of reverence. People rose slightly from their seats to catch a glimpse. This was more than a hearing. It was the country confronting its own conscience. Chairman Jordan struck the gavel. "The committee will come to order," he said, but his voice trembled. The cameras zoomed in. The nation leaned closer. Crockett took her seat, folding her hands in front of her, eyes locked on Miller. It had been years since their first exchange, but the emotional residue still lingered in the air like smoke from an old fire. Miller cleared his throat and straightened his tie, as though trying to conjure the version of himself that once commanded rooms. But that man was gone. What sat before Congress now was the remnant of power, not power itself. Crockett began, her tone calm and deliberate. "Mr. Miller, we meet again under oath. The American people have waited a long time for answers." Miller's jaw flexed. "Congresswoman," he began, "I've cooperated fully with this investigation." "Then let's continue that cooperation," she said, flipping open her folder. "You've had 3 years to reflect. Looking back, do you believe the family separation policy was wrong?" A long silence followed. He adjusted his microphone, stalling for time. "I believe," he said finally, "that every administration faces hard choices at the border. Some of those choices are misunderstood by the public." Crockett didn't blink. That wasn't my question. The audience shifted. Reporters began typing again, their fingers racing to capture every pause. Miller swallowed. Mistakes were made, he muttered. Mistakes, Crockett repeated slowly, her voice soft but cutting. When a surgeon makes a mistake, a life is lost. When an engineer makes a mistake, a bridge collapses. When you made a mistake, families were torn apart, children screamed for their parents, and an entire nation questioned its soul. Mistakes feels like a small word for such a large wound, doesn't it? Miller exhaled sharply. Congresswoman, you're trying to moralize a national security issue. No, she replied. I'm trying to humanize a policy that forgot what being human meant. The room broke into quiet gasps. Even the cameramen froze, unwilling to miss a single breath. For the next 40 minutes, the two faced off like seasoned veterans of a moral war. Crockett presented document after document. Emails, memos, internal notes, all pointing to a single, inescapable truth. That deterrence had always been the goal. That pain had been a strategy, not a byproduct. Miller tried to defend himself, but each response tangled him deeper. When he insisted he'd acted on legal advice, she pulled up a memo showing that legal counsel had warned him of constitutional violations. When he said he'd been misunderstood, she read his own words aloud, projected on a massive screen for the entire world to see. By the time she finished, the defense he'd carried like armor had cracked completely. Viewers across America watched in silence. Cable news anchors stopped interrupting their feeds with commentary. It was the kind of moment that transcended politics. It became about right and wrong, truth and denial. After a particularly long exchange, Crockett leaned back and said softly, Mr. Miller, I think the American people understand now. You didn't make a policy mistake. You made a moral one. Miller stared at her, lips trembling, and for a brief second, it looked as if he might cry. But pride held the tears hostage. He reached for his water glass, his hand shaking slightly. Crockett didn't move, didn't gloat. She simply let the silence sit, heavy and unrelenting. That silence became the story once again. Reporters would later write that you could feel history crystallizing in that quiet, an era of cruelty being cross-examined by the voice of empathy. When the questioning ended, Chairman Jordan gave Miller a chance for closing remarks. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice hoarse. I want to say, he began, that I never intended to hurt anyone. I believed in protecting this country. I still do. Crockett nodded slightly. Intent is what we tell ourselves, she said gently. Impact is what the world remembers. He looked up at her, eyes glistening, but she had already turned away. The gavel struck. The hearing was adjourned. The crowd exploded into sound. Reporters shouting, cameras flashing, people clapping despite the chairman's pleas for order. Outside, the steps of the Capitol filled with voices chanting Crockett's name, waving banners that read, Accountability wins, and truth still matters. Across television networks, her image filled every screen. Analysts called the hearing the closing chapter of an American reckoning. Historians compared it to the Watergate hearings, saying it restored something people thought was lost. Faith that truth could still triumph over power. But beyond the headlines, real change began. Within months, Congress passed new bipartisan safeguards, ensuring no future administration could separate children from parents as an immigration tactic. Crockett's Family Protection Act became law with overwhelming support. The Department of Homeland Security implemented a family tracking system to reunite all remaining separated families. Former detainees were granted humanitarian aid, and perhaps most symbolically, the US government issued a formal public apology to every affected family. The president signed the statement live on national television, flanked by lawmakers from both parties. He quoted Crockett's famous words, "Your legacy isn't strength, It's the sound of children crying. The chamber erupted in applause. Meanwhile, Stephen Miller disappeared from the public eye. His think tank quietly dissolved. His media appearances stopped. Occasionally, reporters spotted him entering courthouses for closed-door depositions, but he declined interviews. When asked about him, Crockett only said, "I hope he finds his own accountability, not for politics, for peace." Her refusal to gloat only elevated her reputation further. Polls showed record levels of trust in her leadership, especially among independents. Editorials praised her rare balance of empathy and precision. In an era of shouting, one columnist wrote, "She reminded America how to listen." A year later, Crockett delivered a speech at the National Archives, standing in front of the original Constitution. "Democracy," she said, "isn't just about laws. It's about memory. When we forget what we've done wrong, we guarantee we'll do it again. Remembering isn't shame, it's responsibility." Her words earned a standing ovation. In classrooms, teachers showed her hearings to students studying civic ethics. Law schools analyzed her cross-examination techniques as models of factual advocacy. She became not just a politician, but a case study in leadership, grounded in truth. Outside the political world, families once separated began to heal. Nonprofits helped parents locate children, and for the first time in years, some were reunited on live television. Tears streamed as children ran into the arms of parents they hadn't seen since infancy. Reporters captured those moments with trembling voices. "This," one said, "is what justice looks like in human form." And each time those reunions aired, Jasmine Crockett's words echoed again. "You can interrupt my voice, but not the truth." By the second anniversary of the final hearing, Washington held a bipartisan ceremony to commemorate the reforms. Crockett was invited as the keynote speaker. She stood before a packed audience of lawmakers, activists, and families, her voice steady but emotional. "Accountability isn't about punishing people," she said. "It's about proving that truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's painful, because the moment we stop caring about truth, democracy dies quietly in the corner." The audience rose to its feet. Even her political opponents clapped. The clip aired across networks under the headline, "The Return of Integrity." That night, back in her office, Crockett sat alone looking out over the Capitol dome. The lights shimmered against the night sky. She opened her folder one last time, the same one she had carried into every hearing, now filled with worn pages, coffee stains, and notes scribbled in the margins. At the bottom was a photograph of a little girl from a border shelter, holding a handwritten sign that said, "I just want my mom." Crockett traced the edges of the photo with her fingers and whispered, "We did it!" Outside, the world kept moving. The news cycle shifted. New controversies rose and fell. But the Crockett-Miller hearings remained etched in collective memory. They had become more than an event. They were a turning point. A reminder that even in a cynical age, integrity could still change history. Documentaries revisited the footage. Podcasts analyzed every word. And scholars called it the day truth spoke louder than power. The story entered history books, told not as a clash between two politicians, but as proof that democracy still had a heartbeat. And that is how it ended. Not with chaos, not with scandal, but with a quiet reaffirmation of what the country could be at its best. Honest, accountable, compassionate. Jasmine Crockett didn't become a celebrity. She became a symbol, and Stephen Miller became a lesson. One reminded the nation of its promise, the other of its warning. Together, their story formed the mirror through which America saw itself, flawed but capable of redemption. So if you've stayed with us through this incredible journey of truth, accountability, and courage, don't just close this video. Be part of the change. Hit that subscribe button right now to stay informed. Share this story with someone who still believes in justice. Comment below and tell us what you think truth means in today's America. And remember, silence only wins when good people stop speaking. Stay engaged, stay awake, and never stop holding power accountable. This is your channel for stories that matter, where truth has a voice, and where courage, no matter how quiet, always wins.